2 hours after I drove away from my mother-in-law's anniversary dinner, my husband was pounding on the front door of our house while I sat inside with every light turned off, staring at a voicemail I still couldn't believe was real. It wasn't from a friend. It wasn't from the police. It wasn't even from anyone in my husband's family. It was from the attorney who had handled my late father-in-law's estate. He said there were documents I needed to see immediately because what had happened that evening had activated something my father-in-law had planned years ago. At the time, I didn't understand what that meant. All I knew was that my husband had looked me in the eyes, believed the worst about me without asking a single question, and told me to apologize for stealing something I had never touched. If you had asked me that morning whether my marriage was in trouble, I would have smiled and said every marriage has difficult seasons. I believed that. I believed patience fixed almost everything. Looking back now, I realize patience can quietly become permission, and I had been giving everyone around me permission to treat me like I would never leave. My name is Natalie Brooks. I'm 39 years old, and for nearly 10 years I tried harder to be accepted by my husband's family than I ever tried to build my own happiness. Daniel and I met through mutual friends shortly after I opened my interior design studio. He was thoughtful, funny, and had a way of making everyone around him feel comfortable. When he proposed 2 years later, I believed I wasn't just marrying him. I believed I was joining a family that valued loyalty as much as I did. His father, Robert Brooks, welcomed me from the very beginning. He loved asking about my projects, always wanted my opinion whenever the family business remodeled one of its furniture showrooms, and once joked that I had better taste than all three of his managers combined. His mother, Margaret, was different. She was never openly cruel. She simply carried herself like no woman would ever be good enough for her only son. Every compliment from her felt borrowed. Every smile seemed temporary. I convinced myself she simply needed time. Time became years before I noticed nothing had really changed. The anniversary dinner that Saturday was supposed to celebrate what would have been Robert and Margaret's 45th wedding anniversary. Robert had passed away 3 years earlier, but Margaret insisted the family still gather every year because traditions kept people together. Daniel and I arrived before anyone else because I had volunteered to help. I arranged flowers across the dining room table, adjusted the lighting in the backyard, helped the caterer move serving trays, and even repaired a loose cabinet hinge because it bothered Margaret every time she walked into the kitchen. She watched me work without saying much, but when she finally looked around the house, she nodded once. "It looks nice," she said. Coming from Margaret, those 3 words felt like winning an award. "I'm glad you like it," I answered with a smile. For a moment, I honestly believed we were turning a corner. Guests began arriving around 4 in the afternoon. Daniel's cousins filled the backyard with laughter. His aunt brought homemade desserts. His younger nephew chased bubbles across the lawn while everyone laughed. It looked exactly like the kind of family gathering people post online with captions about gratitude and togetherness. I kept moving between the kitchen and the dining room, making sure everyone had drinks, checking on the food, wiping down counters that didn't even need cleaning. That was always my role. I noticed Daniel talking with his cousins near the grill, laughing so hard he nearly dropped his drink. Seeing him relaxed made all my effort feel worthwhile. At least, that's what I told myself. Dinner was almost ready when Margaret disappeared upstairs to change into the diamond earrings Robert had given her decades earlier. A few minutes later, I walked through the hallway carrying clean serving plates into the dining room. I passed the staircase just as Margaret came back down. She suddenly froze halfway across the room. Her eyes dropped to her left hand. Then she grabbed her wrist with her other hand so tightly her knuckles turned white. "Where's my ring?" she whispered. Nobody answered because nobody understood what she meant. She looked around the room again, this time louder. "My wedding ring." Every conversation stopped. Chairs scraped across the floor as everyone stood. Margaret began checking every finger, every pocket, every fold in her dress as panic spread across her face. Daniel hurried over. "Mom? It has to be here somewhere." It was on my finger before I went upstairs. She looked toward the staircase. I know it was. Immediately everyone started searching. People looked beneath furniture, inside the bathroom, under the dining table. I set my serving tray on the counter and joined them. I checked the hallway rug twice before looking behind a side table. 10 minutes passed without anyone finding it. Then Margaret suddenly looked directly at me. "Natalie," she said quietly. "You were upstairs earlier, weren't you?" My stomach tightened. Only to bring the guest towels into the bathroom. She stared at me for several long seconds. "Were you alone?" The room became painfully quiet. "Yes," I answered, confused. "Why?" She folded her arms. "Because you're the only person who was upstairs besides me." It took me a second to understand what she was suggesting. When I finally did, I laughed softly because it seemed too ridiculous to be serious. "Margaret, you don't actually think I took your ring?" She didn't answer. She didn't have to. Her silence said enough. Daniel stepped between us. Relief washed over me. Surely he would end this before it became something ugly. Instead, he rubbed the back of his neck and sighed. "Natalie." His voice wasn't angry. It was worse, it was tired, like I had become another problem he wanted solved quickly. "If Mom feels like something happened, maybe just apologize so we can calm everyone down." I stared at him. "Apologize for stealing a ring I didn't steal." He lowered his voice. "I'm not saying you took it." "Then what are you saying?" He glanced around the room, embarrassed that everyone was watching. "I'm saying this isn't the time to argue." Margaret looked away dramatically, wiping tears from her eyes. One of Daniel's cousins avoided looking at me altogether. Another pretended to keep searching under the sofa. Not one person spoke in my defense. I realized something terrifying in that moment. It didn't matter whether I was innocent. They had already decided I was the easiest person to blame. I looked back at Daniel, hoping for one last chance, hoping he'd laugh and say everyone was overreacting. Instead, he quietly repeated, "Please, Natalie, just apologize." Something inside me became strangely calm. I set the dish towel in my hands onto the kitchen counter, removed my apron, folded it carefully, and placed it beside the serving plates I'd spent all afternoon preparing. "No," I said. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. I picked up my purse from the hallway chair and walked toward the front door. Daniel called my name once. I didn't stop. Nobody followed me outside. Nobody asked if I was okay. As I drove away from the house, I wasn't crying. I wasn't even angry anymore. I was trying to remember the last time someone in that family had believed me before believing each other. I couldn't remember. 20 minutes later, while sitting alone at a red light, my phone vibrated with a number I didn't recognize. I almost ignored it. Instead, I let it ring into voicemail. 2 minutes later, it rang again, then a third time. When I finally listened to the message, every hair on my arm stood up. "Miss Brooks," the calm voice said. "This is Evelyn Carter. I handled your late father-in-law's estate. Please contact me as soon as possible. What happened today requires your immediate attention." Suddenly, the missing wedding ring no longer felt like the biggest secret waiting for me that night. I didn't call the number back right away. I drove until I found a quiet parking lot outside a neighborhood park and sat there with my hands resting on the steering wheel, listening to the voicemail again. The woman introduced herself as Evelyn Carter from Carter N. Hayes Legal. She spoke slowly, almost carefully, as if she understood that whatever she was about to tell me would only make sense after I had a chance to breathe. She never mentioned the missing wedding ring. She never mentioned Daniel or Margaret. She simply said, "This matter concerns your late father-in-law's wishes. I believe tonight's events have made it important that we meet as soon as possible." I looked through my windshield at children playing on the swings while parents chatted nearby. The ordinary scene felt strangely distant from the mess I had just left behind. 10 years of marriage suddenly seemed impossible to measure. Was it really one accusation that had broken everything? Deep down, I already knew the answer. The ring wasn't what broke my marriage. It was only the moment that exposed a crack that had been spreading quietly for years. I started the engine again and drove home. The house felt unusually silent when I stepped inside. Daniel's jacket was gone. His shoes weren't by the front door. And the kitchen looked exactly the way we had left it that morning. On the refrigerator hung the grocery list I'd written the night before, reminding myself to buy fresh flowers for Margaret because white lilies had always been her favorite. I stared at that list for a long moment before taking it down and throwing it into the trash. It wasn't the flowers that made me emotional. It was realizing how naturally I had spent years thinking about everyone else's comfort before my own. I made myself a cup of tea, but forgot to drink it. Instead, I sat by the dining room window while memories I had spent years pushing aside began returning one after another. When Daniel and I married, Robert Brooks was still running Brooks Heritage Furniture. It wasn't a huge company, but it had a respected reputation throughout the region for handcrafted dining tables and custom cabinetry. Robert loved craftsmanship. He believed good furniture should outlive the people who built it. The first time I visited one of the company's showrooms, I casually suggested rearranging the lighting because the walnut dining sets looked dull under the old fixtures. Robert smiled and said, "Show me." I spent 2 hours moving displays, changing the lighting angles, and creating a warmer layout. Sales increased noticeably the following month. Robert never forgot it. Margaret, however, simply said, "You have an eye for decorating." It sounded like a compliment until she added, "Just don't expect to tell us how to run the business." I laughed politely because I assumed she was joking. Later I realized she rarely joked. She simply wrapped criticism in calm voices. Still, I refused to believe she disliked me. Every family needed time to adjust. When Robert suffered a minor heart attack 2 years later, everything changed. Daniel's workload increased overnight, and Margaret suddenly found herself overwhelmed with hospital visits, insurance paperwork, and household responsibilities she had never handled alone. Without anyone asking, I stepped in. I drove Robert to physical therapy appointments whenever Daniel had meetings. I organized his medications into labeled containers. I redesigned the downstairs guest room so Robert wouldn't have to climb stairs while recovering. Margaret accepted my help without ever saying thank you, but I didn't need gratitude. At least that's what I kept telling myself. After Robert recovered, life slowly returned to normal. Yet somehow my role never did. Whenever something needed organizing, everyone called me. Holiday dinners, charity events, showroom remodels, even Daniel's cousin's wedding reception. I became the invisible person everyone depended on but rarely noticed. One Christmas, I stayed awake until 2 in the morning assembling handmade gift baskets for every employee in the family business because Margaret wanted something personal. The next afternoon, relatives praised Margaret for her generosity while she accepted every compliment with a gracious smile. Daniel leaned over and whispered, "You know she couldn't have done it without you." I smiled back, waiting for him to say that aloud. He never did. Small moments like that accumulated quietly over the years. They weren't dramatic enough to argue about. They simply left tiny marks that eventually became impossible to ignore. Margaret had a habit of questioning me whenever something went wrong. If a reservation disappeared at a restaurant, she would ask whether I had called to confirm it. If one of the grandchildren spilled juice on the carpet, she somehow wanted to know why I hadn't noticed sooner. If Daniel forgot someone's birthday, she'd gently remind everyone how busy her son always was before looking at me and saying, "You usually remember these things." Daniel rarely disagreed with her. He would squeeze my hand beneath the table afterward and say, "She's old-fashioned. Don't take it personally." I wanted to believe him because believing him was easier than admitting my husband consistently chose comfort over truth. The hardest year came after Robert passed away. Margaret changed almost overnight. Grief made her quieter, but it also made her more suspicious. She insisted on handling every financial document herself. She checked locks twice before bed. She counted family heirlooms after every holiday gathering. I understood that grief can change people. I tried even harder to be patient. Every Sunday afternoon, I drove to her house with groceries because Daniel usually worked weekends. I'd repair loose cabinet doors, help organize paperwork, or simply sit with her while she looked through old photo albums. One afternoon, she found an old picture of Robert standing proudly beside the company's first workshop. She handed it to me and said softly, "He always thought you understood what this family was trying to build." It was one of the kindest things she had ever said to me. I remember driving home that evening convinced we had finally grown closer. Looking back now, I realize our relationship was never as secure as I imagined. All it took was one missing ring for years of quiet trust to disappear. My phone buzzed again, pulling me back into the present. Daniel. I watched his name flash across the screen until it stopped. Seconds later, another call came. Then another. Finally, a text appeared. "Can we please talk? Mom's upset." I almost laughed at the wording. Mom's upset. Not "Are you okay?" Not "I know you didn't do it." Not even "I'm sorry." His greatest concern was still protecting everyone else's emotions before mine. I set the phone face down without replying. 10 minutes later, another message arrived. She still can't find the ring. Please don't make this harder than it already is. I closed my eyes. Somehow, even after everything, I was still the one making life difficult. My phone rang again, but this time it wasn't Daniel. It was the same unfamiliar number from earlier. I answered. Mrs. Brooks, Evelyn Carter asked gently. I know this has been an incredibly difficult evening, but I truly believe your father-in-law expected this day might come. There are some documents you deserve to see. Can you meet me tomorrow morning? My heart skipped. Does this have something to do with Robert? There was a brief silence before she answered. Yes? And I think you'll finally understand why he trusted you more than you ever realized. I looked toward the dark window where my own reflection stared back at me. For the first time since leaving Margaret's house, I felt something besides sadness. I felt curiosity, because whatever Robert had left behind, it had been waiting for years, and somehow tonight had finally unlocked it. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Daniel standing in the dining room with his arms folded, asking me to apologize for something I hadn't done. The words themselves weren't what haunted me. It was how quickly they came out of his mouth, as though believing me had never even crossed his mind. Around 6 the next morning, I gave up trying to sleep, made a cup of coffee, and sat on the back porch watching the sun rise over the neighborhood. My phone remained silent for almost an hour. Then a text from Daniel appeared. I'm coming home after I help Mom finish searching. We need to talk. I stared at the message without opening it. For the first time in nearly 10 years, I wasn't planning my response before he had even arrived. Instead, I got dressed, gathered my purse, and drove across town to the address Evelyn Carter had given me. Carter N. Hayes occupied the second floor of a renovated brick building that overlooked the old courthouse square. It wasn't the kind of office that impressed people with luxury. Everything about it felt quiet and deliberate. Framed black and white photographs lined the hallway. Thick oak doors muted every sound. Even the receptionist spoke softly, as though everyone who entered the building carried something heavy. Where is Brooks? She asked with a warm smile. Carter is expecting you. Evelyn Carter was probably in her early 60s. Her silver hair was neatly pinned back, and she greeted me with the calm confidence of someone who had spent decades helping families through complicated moments. She shook my hand firmly before motioning toward a chair across from her desk. Thank you for coming on such short notice. Your voicemail made it sound important, I replied. It is. She waited until I had settled into the chair before sliding a thick leather folder across the desk. My name was printed neatly on a tab attached to the front. Before we begin, she said, I need you to understand something. None of what you're about to see was created because of what happened yesterday. Every document in this folder has existed for years. I frowned. Then why call me now? Evelyn folded her hands together. Because yesterday was the first time the conditions surrounding these documents may have changed. She opened the folder. Inside were copies of legal paperwork, trust agreements, handwritten notes, and a letter bearing Robert Brooks's unmistakable signature. My eyes immediately stopped on the trust document. The Robert Brooks Family Stewardship Trust. I looked up. I don't understand. Evelyn nodded as though she'd expected that reaction. Most people wouldn't. She turned several pages until she reached a section marked Trust Protector Appointment. My heart nearly stopped when I saw my own name. Natalie Brooks. This has to be a mistake? It isn't. She pushed the document closer so I could read the signatures myself. Robert's signature appeared at the bottom beside 2 witness signatures and a notary seal dated almost 18 months before his death. Robert appointed you as trust protector shortly after his heart surgery. I blinked several times. Daniel never mentioned any of this. Evelyn gave me a sympathetic smile. Daniel doesn't know. That sentence echoed in my head. Doesn't know? No, Margaret. She knows a trust exists. Evelyn answered carefully. She does not know every provision inside it. I leaned back in my chair, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. Why would Robert choose me? He had a son. Evelyn reached for another folder. Because your father-in-law wasn't looking for the next owner. She paused before continuing. He was looking for someone he believed would protect the values the business was built on. I couldn't stop shaking my head. I never even worked for the company? No. Evelyn agreed. But you quietly protected it more often than anyone realized. She opened another file filled with photographs and invoices. I immediately recognized one of them. It showed the company's flagship showroom before and after I redesigned the display layout. There were receipts for furniture restoration projects I'd organized after a flood damaged one of the warehouses. There were handwritten thank you notes from longtime employees I'd helped during difficult times without ever mentioning it to Daniel. Evelyn noticed the confusion on my face. Robert kept records of these things. Why? Because he believed character isn't measured by titles. It's measured by the work people do when nobody is keeping score. I felt tears building behind my eyes. Robert had thanked me many times while he was alive, but I never imagined he had noticed so much. Evelyn continued. Several months before he passed away, Robert asked me to review the succession plan for Brooks Heritage Furniture. I thought Daniel automatically inherited the company. Legally, ownership transferred to Margaret first. Evelyn tapped the trust agreement. Operational authority was intended to pass to Daniel eventually, but only if certain conditions were satisfied. Conditions. Wise. She turned another page. Robert believed leadership required fairness, accountability, and the ability to protect family without favoritism. My stomach tightened. If those standards weren't met? Evelyn looked directly at me. Then the trust protector has the authority to request an independent review of leadership before permanent control is transferred. I stared at the page. Every sentence seemed impossible. You're saying, I could stop Daniel from taking over, not alone. Evelyn answered immediately. You cannot remove anyone by yourself, but you can trigger an independent review by the Trust Council if you believe Robert's standards have been violated. I rubbed my forehead. This can't be happening. I imagine it feels overwhelming. It feels unreal. She nodded. That's understandable. We sat quietly for a moment before I asked the question that had been bothering me most. Why didn't Robert tell me? Evelyn smiled sadly. He wanted you to live your life freely. He worried that if you knew about this responsibility too early, you'd begin second, guessing every decision you made with the family. I looked down at Robert's signature again. Suddenly memories returned that hadn't crossed my mind in years. Robert asking my opinion before making difficult business decisions. Robert insisting I sit beside him during family dinners. Robert once saying, almost casually, sometimes the people carrying the most weight don't even realize they're doing it. I had laughed at the time. Now I wondered if he had been speaking more literally than I ever understood. Evelyn reached for the final envelope in the folder. Unlike the legal documents, this one looked personal. Robert's handwriting covered the front. For Natalie. Only if the time ever comes when she begins doubting her place in this family. My throat tightened. He left me a letter. Evelyn nodded. Yes. Can I read it? Not yet. She gently rested her hand on the envelope. Robert instructed me to wait until one final condition was met. My heartbeat quickened again. There's another condition. Evelyn slowly turned to the final page of the trust agreement. Her expression grew more serious than it had been all morning. Natalie. There's one clause Daniel has never seen. And after what happened yesterday, I believe we need to discuss whether that clause has just been activated. I looked at Evelyn without saying a word. My hands were resting on Robert's letter, but I didn't dare touch the envelope again. Somehow, I knew that once I crossed whatever line existed between those documents and the truth they contained, there would be no going back. Evelyn waited until she was sure I had collected myself before turning the final page toward me. The heading at the top read Article 7 Stewardship Review Authority. It wasn't written in complicated legal language like the rest of the trust. Robert had insisted that this section be simple enough for every family member to understand if it ever became necessary. Evelyn traced one paragraph with her finger. Read this one. I leaned forward. If the acting successor repeatedly demonstrates favoritism, refuses to investigate serious accusations fairly, or knowingly sacrifices truth to preserve appearances, the trust protector may request an immediate stewardship review before permanent authority transfers. I read the paragraph twice. Then a third time? Favoritism? I whispered. He actually wrote that word. Evelyn nodded. Robert believed favoritism destroys families faster than money ever could. I couldn't help thinking about the night before. Daniel hadn't accused me of stealing the ring. In fact, he had carefully avoided saying the words, but he hadn't defended me either. He had simply chosen the easiest path. He had chosen the person he believed was less likely to forgive him if she became upset. For years, I had mistaken that behavior for conflict avoidance. Sitting in Evelyn's office, I finally saw it for what it really was. It was favoritism disguised as peacekeeping. Yesterday wasn't the first time, I admitted quietly. Evelyn looked at me with gentle curiosity. Would you like to tell me about the others? At first I didn't think I could, but once I started talking, memories came faster than I could organize them. I told her about the Christmas dinner when Margaret insisted I had forgotten to order enough food, even though one of Daniel's cousins later admitted she had changed the guest list without telling me. Daniel had hugged me afterward and said, "Just let it go." I told her about the family vacation where Margaret accused me of booking the wrong hotel after she herself had changed the reservation dates. Daniel had smiled awkwardly and whispered, "She's already stressed. Don't make this bigger." I told her about the countless smaller moments that no outsider would ever consider important. Every birthday forgotten because someone assumed I would organize it. Every holiday meal where I cooked while everyone else sat outside talking. Every family photo where Margaret insisted I stand near the edge because the children should be closer. None of those moments had ended in screaming. None of them had seemed dramatic enough to leave over. Yet together they had quietly taught me something dangerous, that my feelings always ranked below everyone else's comfort. Evelyn listened without interrupting. When I finished, she remained silent for several seconds before speaking. Robert noticed much more than you realize. She opened another folder, this one thinner than the others. Inside were several pages of handwritten notes dated over the last 4 years of Robert's life. They weren't formal documents. They looked almost like journal entries. Evelyn handed me the first page. Natalie stayed until midnight helping Margaret after everyone else left. Daniel thanked her in the car but never thanked her in front of his mother. Another page. Margaret criticized the showroom redesign in public. Later admitted privately it improved customer traffic. Natalie smiled anyway. Another. Daniel avoids conflict by asking Natalie to compromise every time. She always does. One day she won't. I stared at Robert's handwriting until the words blurred. He had seen everything. All those little moments I convinced myself didn't matter had mattered to someone. Never said any of this to me. I whispered. Because he hoped Daniel would eventually recognize it himself. Evelyn answered. Robert believed people should become better because they choose to, not because they're forced. And if they didn't, Evelyn sighed softly. That's why this trust exists. I looked back at the legal documents. If I request this stewardship review, what actually happens? Nothing dramatic at first. She smiled faintly. This isn't a courtroom. She explained that Brooks Heritage Furniture wasn't owned by one person alone anymore. Robert had gradually transferred shares into the trust before his death. Margaret remained the primary beneficiary during her lifetime, but long-term operational control would only pass to Daniel after the Trust Council confirmed he met Robert's standards. The council consisted of 5 independent members: the company's longtime accountant, its retired operations director, Robert's attorney and outside business advisor, and Evelyn herself. They're not there to punish anyone, she explained. Their responsibility is to determine whether Robert's wishes are being honored. And yesterday could change that. Yesterday may be evidence, Evelyn corrected gently. But reviews are never based on one incident. She slid another document across the desk. The council considers patterns. That single word landed harder than everything else. Patterns, not one missing ring, not one argument, 10 years of choices. 10 years of Daniel asking me to be the reasonable one because it was easier than confronting his mother. 10 years of Margaret assuming I should carry responsibilities without expecting respect. You said yesterday may have activated something, I said. What did you mean? Evelyn reached into the folder and removed a sealed envelope with the Trust Council's emblem. Robert anticipated there might come a day when a significant family incident exposed an existing pattern. She placed the envelope carefully on the desk. If the trust protector believes that moment has arrived, she may request a stewardship review. Me. Only you. I swallowed hard. I never wanted any of this. I know. I don't want Daniel to lose everything. Evelyn's expression softened. Natalie, this review isn't about taking something away from Daniel. She paused before adding. It's about determining whether he has already given it away through his own choices. I looked toward the office window. Outside, people walked across the courthouse square carrying coffee cups, talking on phones, living completely ordinary mornings. Mine no longer felt ordinary. "What happens if I say no?" I asked. Evelyn answered immediately. "Then nothing changes. Danielle eventually takes over the company?" "Yes. Margaret never learns about yesterday." Evelyn hesitated. "She may learn the truth about the ring eventually. But everything else stays the same. Most likely." I leaned back in my chair. For years I had believed keeping peace meant accepting whatever hurt came my way. Robert, somehow, had believed the opposite. He believed real peace couldn't exist without fairness. Evelyn gently pushed Robert's unopened letter toward me again. "You still can't read this until after you've made your decision." I gave a tired smile. He really thought of everything, didn't he? I hoped he'd never need to. Before I could answer, my phone vibrated across the desk. Daniel's name filled the screen again. This time it wasn't a text. It was another call, then another, almost immediately after the first stopped. Evelyn glanced at the screen before looking back at me. "Has he apologized?" I let the phone ring until it went silent. Then I looked at Evelyn and quietly answered, "No." A second later, another message appeared. "Mom says she wants to explain. Please come back." I stared at the words for a long moment before locking the screen without replying. Then I turned back toward Evelyn. "Tell me how to begin the review." For nearly 10 years, I had believed the strongest thing I could do was keep forgiving people who never admitted they had hurt me. Sitting across from Evelyn Carter that morning, I realized strength sometimes looked completely different. Sometimes it looked like refusing to pretend everything was fine simply because everyone else preferred comfort over honesty. Even so, asking for a stewardship review felt impossibly heavy. I wasn't trying to punish Daniel. I wasn't trying to take his family's business away from him. I simply couldn't ignore what Robert had spent years trying to protect. Evelyn slid a single-page request form toward me. It wasn't dramatic. There were no threatening legal phrases or complicated instructions. It simply asked whether, in my judgment as trust protector, there was sufficient reason to believe the values outlined by Robert Brooks had been compromised. My name appeared beside a signature line at the bottom. I stared at it for almost a full minute. "You don't have to decide today," Evelyn said quietly. "Robert specifically instructed us never to pressure you." I looked up. "What would you do if you were me?" She smiled, but instead of answering immediately, she folded her hands together. "After 35 years of practicing family law, I've learned something. People almost never regret telling the truth. They regret how long they waited." That answer stayed with me. I picked up the pen, signed my name, and slowly slid the document back across the desk. Evelyn didn't celebrate. She didn't even smile. She simply nodded once, placed the request into a folder, and said, "I'll notify the Trust Council this afternoon." The simplicity of the moment surprised me. There was no dramatic announcement, no instant consequences, just one signature that quietly set years of planning into motion. Before I left, Evelyn handed me a business card with her direct number written on the back. "Daniel and Margaret may contact you," she said. "Whether you respond is entirely your choice. But until the council meets, I recommend you avoid discussing the trust with anyone, including Daniel. Especially Daniel." I nodded. Robert had trusted me with something his own son didn't know existed. The weight of that responsibility followed me all the way to my car. I hadn't even started the engine when my phone rang again. "Daniel." This time I answered. There was a long pause before he spoke. "Natalie." His voice sounded exhausted. "I've been calling you since last night." "I know. Can we meet?" I looked through the windshield at people crossing the street with coffee cups in their hands. Their lives seemed wonderfully uncomplicated. "Why?" I asked. "Because this whole thing got out of control." I waited. "Mom's upset," he continued. "She barely slept. Again. Everything revolved around Margaret's feelings." "Did she find the ring?" I asked. "Not yet." "Do you believe I took it?" Silence. I closed my eyes. "Daniel?" he sighed. "I don't know what to believe." Those 6 words hurt more than the accusation itself. We had shared nearly a decade of our lives. We had built a home together. We had cared for his father through illness, celebrated promotions, buried loved ones, and comforted each other through losses. Yet one missing ring had erased all of that. "You don't know what to believe." I repeated quietly. "Natalie, no. Answer me honestly." Another pause. "I think maybe something happened that you don't remember." I laughed once, not because anything was funny, but because I suddenly understood how far apart we had grown. He wasn't accusing me directly. He had simply found a version of reality where I could still be responsible without him having to admit his mother might be wrong. It was exactly what Robert had written in his notes. Daniel always searched for explanations that protected everyone except the person standing beside him. I have a meeting? I said. We'll talk later. Natalie, please don't do this. Don't do what? Pull away. My voice remained calm. Daniel, I didn't pull away yesterday. You pushed me. I ended the call before he could answer. The drive home felt strangely peaceful. Maybe it was because, for the first time in years, I wasn't rehearsing ways to make someone else feel better. I unlocked the front door and immediately noticed Daniel sitting at the kitchen table. His car must have been in the garage while I was gone. He stood the moment he saw me. His eyes were red from lack of sleep, and he looked older than he had 24 hours earlier. Where were you? He asked. Oat. I've been worried. I set my purse on the counter. Really? He ignored the question. Mom wants to see you. Why? She wants to explain. Explain what? She was emotional. I stared at him. Daniel, your mother accused me of stealing her wedding ring in front of your entire family. He rubbed his temples. She panicked? Hearned you. He didn't answer. I stepped closer. When you told me to apologize, what exactly did you think I was apologizing for? He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Finally, he said, I thought if everyone calmed down, we'd figure it out later? Later. I asked. You wanted me to admit guilt first and prove my innocence afterward. That's not what I meant. Then what did you mean? He looked genuinely frustrated. Why do you always make everything sound worse than it was? The words landed like a punch. Worse than it was. I suddenly realized Daniel truly believed this argument was about one awkward evening. He had absolutely no idea that years of disappointment had finally reached their limit. Do you remember Christmas 3 years ago? I asked. He frowned. What? When your cousin forgot to tell us 20 extra people were coming. Barely? Your mother blamed me for not ordering enough food. She was stressed. Do you remember the vacation in Vermont? Natalie. She blamed me for the reservation mix-up. It wasn't intentional. The showroom opening. Can we not do this? Every single time something went wrong, I continued. Your solution was the same. Ask me to keep the peace. Daniel shook his head impatiently. Because you're the reasonable one. There it was. The sentence that explained our entire marriage. I was always expected to be reasonable because everyone else had been given permission not to be. I smiled sadly. Do you know what that really means? He looked confused. It means you've decided my feelings are the easiest ones to sacrifice. The room fell completely silent. Daniel looked at me as though he wanted to disagree but couldn't quite find the words. Finally, he walked toward me. I'm asking you to come back to Mom's house. No, please. No. At least hear her out. I met his eyes. The day your mother accused me wasn't the day our marriage changed. I paused. It was the day you showed me that if I were ever forced to choose between your family's comfort and my own dignity, you had already made your choice. His face fell. Before he could answer, someone knocked on the front door. Daniel opened it, expecting perhaps another relative. Instead, a courier stood outside holding a large certified envelope. Delivery for Mrs. Natalie Brooks, the man said. Daniel glanced at the return address before handing it to me. Across the top, in bold letters, were the words the Robert Brooks Family Stewardship Council. The envelope sat on my kitchen counter like it weighed 100 pounds. Daniel stared at the logo printed in the upper left corner. The same Brooks heritage crest his father had used on company letterhead for decades. He frowned as if trying to remember where he had seen it before. I already knew he wouldn't. Robert had intentionally kept the Stewardship Council separate from the company's daily operations. Most employees knew the council existed in some abstract legal sense, but very few understood what it actually did. Daniel certainly didn't. What is that? He asked. I ran my finger beneath the seal but didn't open it immediately. I don't know yet. That wasn't entirely true. I had a very good idea what was inside, but Evelyn had asked me not to discuss the trust until the council officially notified everyone involved. It's addressed to you, Daniel said. Open it. I looked at him for a moment before carefully breaking the seal. Inside were 2 documents. The first formally acknowledged my request for a stewardship review. The second informed me that the council had unanimously agreed there was sufficient cause to begin its preliminary investigation. A meeting had been scheduled for the following Thursday. As trust protector, I was required to attend. Several other individuals would also be interviewed. Daniel leaned closer, trying to read over my shoulder. I quietly folded the papers before he could. Natalie? His voice was cautious now. What is this? I slipped the documents back into the envelope. Something I need to handle. Handle what? I can't explain yet. That answer only frustrated him more. Can't or won't, both. He let out a short laugh that held no humor. Yesterday we were arguing about a ring. Today you're getting legal letters you won't even show me? Yesterday stopped being about a ring the moment you asked me to apologize for stealing it. He rubbed his face with both hands. I said I wanted everyone to calm down. You wanted me to carry the blame until it became convenient for someone else to remove it. Before he could respond, his phone rang. He glanced at the screen. It's Mom. He answered immediately. Mom. I couldn't hear Margaret's words, but I could hear her voice. She sounded anxious, speaking much faster than usual. Daniel looked at me twice during the conversation. No, he finally answered. Another pause. No, she won't. He sighed heavily. I'll be there in 20 minutes. After hanging up, he slipped the phone into his pocket. They still haven't found the ring. I nodded without saying anything. Mom wants us both there. I'm not going. Natalie. No. People are talking. They already talked yesterday. He walked closer, lowering his voice. Don't you see how this looks? I almost smiled. There it was again. Appearances. They always mattered more than truth. Actually, I said quietly, I think this is the first time everything looks exactly the way it really is. Daniel shook his head in frustration. You're being stubborn. And you're still worried about what everyone thinks instead of what actually happened. He stood silently for several seconds before grabbing his car keys. Fine. Stay here. He stopped at the door. But sooner or later we're going to have this conversation. After he left, the house became wonderfully quiet. I carried the envelope upstairs, locked it inside the small safe where we kept passports and insurance documents, then sat on the edge of the bed. My wedding photograph rested on the nightstand beside me. Daniel and I were both smiling so naturally in that picture. Robert stood behind us with one hand resting proudly on Daniel's shoulder. Margaret smiled too, although even then her smile never quite reached her eyes. I picked up the frame and studied it for a long time. I wasn't remembering the wedding anymore. I was remembering all the promises I'd silently made to myself afterward. I'd promised to be patient, to respect Daniel's family, to never make him choose between his mother and me. Somewhere along the way, that last promise had quietly become permission for him to never choose me at all. Around 3 that afternoon, my phone buzzed. This time it was Evelyn. I wanted to let you know the council has already begun collecting preliminary information. That was fast. Robert designed the review process years ago. Most of the procedures are already in place. I hesitated before asking, what exactly are they reviewing? Everything relevant to Robert's standards? Including yesterday? Yes. Only yesterday. Evelyn's answer surprised me. No. Yesterday simply provided the reason to look deeper. She explained that the council would examine years of management decisions, family interactions connected to the business, written correspondence, financial oversight, and testimony from individuals Robert had specifically identified before his death. Testimony? I repeated. From whom? Longtime employees, former executives, anyone Robert believed had observed Daniel's leadership over time. I hadn't expected that. Somehow I'd imagined the review would revolve entirely around the dinner party. Instead, it was becoming clear that Robert had anticipated exactly this situation years earlier. He hadn't built a system around one argument. He had built one around patterns. After ending the call, I found myself thinking about Robert's final years. There had been moments I hadn't understood at the time. He often invited me to walk through the workshop with him after lunch. We'd stop to watch craftsmen sanding tabletops or assembling cabinets. Sometimes he'd ask simple questions. How do you think people stay loyal to a company? I'd answer something about fair pay or good leadership. He'd smile and say, respect. People stay where they're respected. Another memory surfaced. About 6 months before he died, Daniel had become frustrated with one of the production managers who questioned a scheduling decision. Daniel wanted to fire him immediately. Robert refused. Challenged your idea, Robert had said calmly. Didn't betray you. Daniel had rolled his eyes afterward and complained all the way home. Dad always sides with employees. At the time, I thought it was a simple disagreement about business. Now I wondered if Robert had been trying to teach his son something much larger. Late that evening, my phone rang again. I expected Daniel. Instead, Margaret's name appeared on the screen. I stared at it until the call nearly ended before answering. Neither of us spoke at first. Finally, she broke the silence. Natally. Yes. Her voice sounded smaller than I had ever heard it. I wanted to ask you something. Go ahead. She hesitated. If someone else took the ring, would you forgive me? The question caught me completely off guard. It wasn't an apology. Not yet. It was almost as though she was testing the possibility that she might have been wrong. I closed my eyes. Margaret, I said gently, the ring isn't the reason I left. Another long silence filled the line. Then what is? She whispered. I looked toward the dark window, where my reflection stared back at me. Because yesterday was the first time you accused me. I paused. But it wasn't the first time either of you decided I didn't deserve to be believed. She didn't answer. I heard only her breathing before the line quietly disconnected. I stood there holding the silent phone for another minute, wondering whether she had hung up him or simply had nothing left to say. The next morning, while the Brooks family continued searching every corner of Margaret's house for the missing wedding ring, someone cleaning the old family photo room pulled a heavy cedar cabinet away from the wall for the first time in years. Behind it, hidden beneath a loose floor vent, they noticed something that had absolutely nothing to do with a wedding ring, but everything to do with Robert Brooks. 3 days after I signed the request for the stewardship review, the truth about the missing wedding ring finally surfaced. But by then, the ring had become the least important thing anyone in the Brooks family would lose. Looking back, I almost wish they had found it on the first night. Maybe Daniel would have apologized. Maybe Margaret would have hugged me through tears. Maybe everyone would have pretended the entire nightmare had been one unfortunate misunderstanding. But that would only have hidden the real problem again. Robert had once told me that unresolved cracks never disappear inside a foundation. People simply stop looking at them until the building begins to collapse. His family was finally collapsing. I was sitting in Evelyn's conference room Thursday morning when my phone vibrated with a text from Daniel. They found the ring. I stared at those 4 words for several seconds before opening the message. There was another sentence beneath it. Mom wants you to come home. She needs to apologize? I slowly locked my phone without replying. Evelyn noticed my expression. Good news? They found the wedding ring. She smiled gently but didn't seem surprised. Robert expected they eventually would. You knew. She shook her head. But objects usually have a way of being found. Character is harder. Before I could answer, 2 members of the Stewardship Council entered the room. One was Harold Simmons, Brooks Heritage Furniture's retired operations director, who had worked alongside Robert for more than 30 years. The other was Linda Chavez, an independent corporate governance advisor Robert had hired during the company's expansion almost a decade earlier. Both greeted me politely. Neither asked about the ring. Neither mentioned Daniel. Instead, Harold looked at me with kind eyes and said, Robert spoke very highly of you. Hearing that still felt strange. I had spent so many years wondering whether anyone noticed the quiet things I did that it almost hurt to discover someone had noticed all along. The preliminary review lasted nearly 4 hours. I answered questions about my involvement with the company, my relationship with Daniel, and the family's dynamics. Nobody asked me whether Margaret was a bad person. Nobody asked whether Daniel loved me. Those weren't the questions Robert had wanted answered. Instead, Harold asked, when disagreements occurred inside the family, who was usually expected to compromise. I looked down at my hands before answering. Linda wrote something in her notebook. How often? I gave a tired smile. Often enough that it stopped feeling unusual. Another council member asked, Can you describe the events surrounding the missing wedding ring without adding opinions? I did exactly that. I explained how Margaret realized it was gone. How everyone searched. How she looked at me. How Daniel asked me to apologize before anyone knew what had happened. I didn't exaggerate. I didn't insult either of them. When I finished, Harold quietly asked one final question. If Daniel had simply said, Natally, I believe you, would you be sitting here today? My answer came without hesitation. No. The room fell completely silent, because everyone understood what that meant. This review had never been about jewelry. It had never been about one argument. It had been about trust. When the meeting ended, Evelyn walked me toward the lobby. "You've done everything Robert asked of you?" she said. "No, the council begins its independent review." "What happens next?" "We'll interview Daniel, Margaret, senior employees, and several individuals Robert identified years ago." "Years ago?" Evelyn nodded. "Robert left a confidential witness list." I stopped walking. "Witnesses. Not to yesterday." She smiled sadly. "To patterns. I thought my surprises were over. I was wrong. That afternoon, while I was driving home, Grace called. My younger sister almost never sounded nervous, but this time she spoke before I could even say hello. "Nat, have you seen the news from the family group chat?" "No." Someone posted pictures. "Pictures of what?" "The ring." I pulled into a parking lot and opened the family chat for the first time since leaving Margaret's house. Dozens of unread messages filled the screen. At the top was a photograph of Margaret's wedding ring lying inside a torn piece of faded velvet. Another picture showed the back of an old cedar display cabinet in the family photo room. According to Daniel's cousin, a cleaning company had moved the cabinet while preparing for a flooring repair. The ring had slipped through a damaged floor vent years earlier and become trapped beneath the loose wooden grate. It had never been stolen. It had never even left the house. My chest tightened, not because I finally had proof of my innocence, but because of what came next. Margaret herself had written a message beneath the photographs. "Natalie, I was wrong. I'm deeply sorry. Please let me explain." Almost immediately other relatives began replying. "We're so relieved. Thank goodness it was found. Let's put this behind us." I stared at the screen in disbelief. Put this behind us, as though the problem had been a misplaced ring instead of the willingness to believe I was capable of stealing it. My phone rang before I could respond. "Daniel." This time I answered. "Natalie." His voice sounded almost hopeful. "You saw the messages?" "Yes." The ring was under the floor vent. "I know. Mom feels terrible." I waited. "She wants to apologize in person." Again I waited. Finally he added, "I do too." My fingers tightened around the phone. "Do you know what hurts the most?" "I know I handled it badly." "No." I took a slow breath. "The worst part is that you only believe me now because someone found evidence." Silence. "They'd never found the ring." I continued quietly. "Would you still think I took it?" He didn't answer. I didn't need him to. His silence told me everything. Because even now, after all that had happened, he couldn't honestly say no. "Natalie, please?" He whispered. "Come home." I looked out across the parking lot where a father was teaching his little daughter to ride a bicycle. Every time she wobbled, he reached out instinctively to steady her. He never questioned whether she deserved his help. He simply protected her, because that was what trust looked like. I suddenly realized I had spent years begging for something that should never have required begging in the first place. "I don't know where home is anymore," I answered softly. Before Daniel could speak again, another call appeared on my screen. "Evelyn." I switched over immediately. "Natalie," she said. "The council has completed its first round of interviews." "Already?" "Yes." Her voice was calm, but I sensed something had changed. Robert's witness statements matched almost every pattern you've described. My heart skipped. "There's something else," she continued. "Daniel has just finished his interview." "How did it go?" There was a brief pause. "He admitted that asking you to apologize without investigating the accusation was a mistake." Relief flickered for half a second before Evelyn finished her sentence. "Then he told the council he would probably make the same decision again, because keeping peace inside the family was more important than challenging his mother's judgment." I closed my eyes. Somehow, hearing those words hurt less than I expected, maybe because they confirmed what I already knew. Daniel hadn't failed me by accident. He truly believed sacrificing me was the responsible thing to do. "The council will issue its findings tomorrow morning," Evelyn said quietly. "Natalie, I think you should prepare yourself. Robert's plan is about to change the Brooks family forever." The following morning felt strangely peaceful, almost as if the world had decided to slow down before everything changed. I woke before my alarm, made coffee, and stood on my back porch watching the neighborhood come alive. For the first time in days, my hands weren't shaking. I wasn't waiting for another accusation or another desperate phone call. Whatever happened next would no longer be decided by emotions, assumptions, or family pressure. It would be decided by the truth Robert had carefully protected years before anyone realized why it mattered. At exactly 9 o'clock, I walked back into Carter and Hayes. Evelyn greeted me with the same calm expression she always wore, but there was something different in her eyes. It wasn't excitement. It was relief. She led me into the conference room where the 5 members of the Stewardship Council were already seated around a long oak table. A thick folder rested in front of each of them. At the opposite end of the room sat Daniel and Margaret. Neither of them looked at me when I entered. Daniel's shoulders were slumped, his tie slightly crooked, and he looked like he hadn't slept in days. Margaret seemed years older than she had the previous week. She held a tissue tightly in one hand, staring down at the polished tabletop as though she wished she could disappear into it. I quietly took the empty chair Evelyn had prepared beside her. Harold Simmons cleared his throat and opened the meeting. This review was initiated under Article 7 of the Robert Brooks Family Stewardship Trust. Our responsibility is not to punish anyone. Our responsibility is to determine whether Robert Brooks's wishes regarding the future stewardship of his family and company are being honored. The room remained silent. Harold continued. Over the past week, we reviewed business records, correspondence, witness statements collected over several years, and interviews conducted with family members and senior employees. He paused before looking directly at Daniel. The council unanimously agrees that this review was not triggered by a missing wedding ring. It was triggered by a pattern that existed long before the ring disappeared. Daniel lowered his head. Margaret quietly closed her eyes. Harold opened another document. Multiple witnesses described repeated situations in which difficult decisions were avoided by asking one individual to absorb blame or sacrifice her own dignity for the sake of family harmony. He looked toward me for only a brief second before continuing. Robert Brooks anticipated this possibility. He wrote extensively that leadership without fairness eventually destroys both businesses and families. Linda Chavez spoke next. Mr. Brooks did not expect perfection from his successor. He expected courage, specifically the courage to investigate before judging, to protect the vulnerable before protecting appearances, and to admit mistakes before demanding sacrifices from others. She turned toward Daniel. During your interview, you acknowledged that if placed in the same situation again, you would likely make the same decision because preserving family peace was your priority. Daniel swallowed hard before quietly answering, "Yes." "Do you still believe that today?" Harold asked. Daniel looked toward me for the first time since I entered the room. His eyes were filled with regret. "No," he admitted. "I finally understand what that choice actually cost." Harold nodded respectfully. Unfortunately, the stewardship review evaluates decisions made when character is tested, not lessons learned afterward. No one spoke for several seconds. Then Evelyn carefully removed Robert's unopened letter from a separate envelope. "There is one final document, Mr. Brooks instructed us to share only after the council reached its findings." She unfolded the pages slowly before reading aloud. "If you are hearing this letter, then my greatest fear has probably come true. Not that someone made a mistake. Everyone makes mistakes. My fear was always that someone would stop searching for the truth, because accepting the easiest explanation felt more comfortable than asking difficult questions." I felt my throat tighten. Evelyn continued reading. "I built furniture for 40 years. The strongest tables fail if one leg carries all the weight while the others pretend everything is balanced. Families are no different. Never ask the kindest person in the room to carry every burden simply because they complain the least." Margaret suddenly covered her face as quiet sobs escaped between her fingers. Robert's words continued. "Daniel, if this letter reaches you, understand that I never doubted your intelligence. I doubted your willingness to disappoint the people you love by telling them they were wrong. Leadership demands that courage. Marriage demands it even more." Daniel closed his eyes. Tears slowly rolled down his face. No one interrupted. No one tried to comfort him. Robert's final paragraph was addressed to me. "Natalie, if you're reading this, then somewhere along the way you probably began wondering whether you truly belonged in this family. I hope you eventually realize belonging was never yours to earn. It was ours to protect. If we failed to do that, then we failed you, not the other way around." By the time Evelyn folded the letter, the room was completely silent. Harold took one slow breath before announcing the council's decision. Effective immediately, the transfer of executive authority to Daniel Brooks is suspended indefinitely. Operational oversight of Brooks Heritage Furniture will remain under the temporary supervision of the Stewardship Council, while an independent executive team is appointed according to the trust's provisions. Daniel nodded slowly. He didn't argue. He didn't ask for another chance. He simply whispered, "I understand." Harold looked toward me. "As trust protector, your responsibilities continue only until the transition is complete. Brooks specifically prohibited you from becoming chief executive yourself because he wanted you to remain independent from family politics." I smiled faintly. That sounded exactly like Robert. He had never wanted me to win. He had only wanted the company to remain protected. The meeting officially ended, but nobody stood up immediately. Margaret slowly walked around the table until she was standing in front of me. For a moment she couldn't speak. Then, with trembling hands, she reached into her purse and placed her wedding ring gently on the table between us. "I've looked at this ring every day for 45 years, she whispered. I thought losing it was the worst thing that could happen to me. She looked into my eyes, tears streaming freely now. "I was wrong. The worst thing I ever lost was your trust." I didn't answer immediately. There was nothing angry left inside me, only sadness. "Margaret," I said softly, "finding the ring didn't erase what happened." "I know," she nodded repeatedly. "And I know saying I'm sorry doesn't erase it either." She took a deep breath. "But I need you to hear me anyway. I judged you before I searched for the truth. I've done that more than once over the years, and I didn't realize how often until this week. Robert saw it. Everyone else eventually saw it. I was the last one to admit it." She carefully slid the ring back into her purse. "You deserved a mother-in-law who protected you. Instead, you spent 10 years protecting me." Tears filled my eyes, but I managed a small smile. "Thank you for finally saying it." She nodded once before quietly leaving the room. Daniel waited until she disappeared into the hallway before approaching me. He looked exhausted, broken even, but for the first time since I had met him. He wasn't trying to defend himself. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said quietly. "I don't even expect another conversation after today." He looked down at his wedding band before continuing. "I just need you to know that Dad wasn't wrong about me. Every time I asked you to keep the peace, I thought I was protecting my family." He slowly shook his head. "I never realized I was asking you to carry all the pain so the rest of us wouldn't have to." I listened without interrupting. "If I could relive one moment," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper, "it wouldn't be the day they found the ring. It would be the moment I looked at you in my mother's dining room and chose convenience instead of trust." He stopped speaking, waiting for me to say something. I looked at the man I had loved for almost 10 years and realized I no longer felt anger toward him. But I also no longer felt the certainty that had once held our marriage together. "Daniel," I said gently, "I believe you're sorry." He nodded, tears returning to his eyes. "But I'm finally learning that someone can love you, Ada, and still fail to protect you when it matters most." He closed his eyes, accepting the truth of those words. Neither of us spoke again as we walked out of the building together, knowing that although the stewardship review had officially ended, another decision, the most personal one of my life, was still waiting for me. The decision I made 3 days later was the hardest one of my life, not because I didn't know what I wanted, but because I finally admitted to myself that wanting someone to change and believing they actually would were two very different things. Daniel hadn't called or texted since the meeting with the Stewardship Council. For years, that kind of silence would have terrified me. I would have assumed he was angry. I would have worried about fixing things before they became worse. The silence felt honest. Neither of us knew how to continue pretending that one apology could rebuild what had slowly been broken over nearly a decade. I spent those 3 days walking through our house room by room. Every corner held memories. The breakfast table where Daniel had surprised me with pancakes on my birthday. The living room where Robert once spent an entire Sunday teaching our nephew how to play chess. The small office where I had stayed up until midnight designing showroom layouts for Brooks Heritage Furniture because I genuinely wanted the family business to succeed. None of those memories were fake. That was the hardest part. My marriage hadn't been built on lies. It had been built on love that was simply too weak whenever it had to compete with fear, obligation, and old family habits. Loving someone isn't always enough if they never learn to stand beside you when it matters most. On Monday morning, I met Evelyn one final time. She handed me a slim folder containing the official conclusion of the stewardship review. The transition process had already begun. An interim executive committee made up of senior managers and 2 outside advisors would oversee Brooks Heritage Furniture until the trust selected a permanent managing director. Daniel would remain a shareholder, but he would no longer receive automatic executive authority simply because he was Robert's son. Robert's company would survive. It would simply move forward under the principles he had fought to protect. Evelyn smiled as she closed the folder. Robert would be relieved. Because the company is safe, I asked. She shook her head. Because you never used the trust for revenge. That sentence stayed with me as I drove away. She was right. At several points, I could have demanded far more than Robert ever intended. I could have insisted on becoming part of the company's leadership. I could have publicly embarrassed Daniel in front of employees or relatives. I could have reminded every family member that Robert had trusted me instead of his own son. None of that would have honored the man who created the trust. Robert never wanted a winner and a loser. He wanted a family capable of telling the truth before it was too late. Unfortunately, they learned that lesson only after losing something far more valuable than a business title. 2 days later, I met Daniel for coffee. It wasn't a date. It wasn't an attempt to save our marriage. It was simply 2 people who had once loved each other trying to leave without hatred. He looked calmer than the last time I had seen him, although the exhaustion remained in his face. He smiled politely as I sat down. Thank you for coming. I thought we owed each other one honest conversation. He nodded. We do. For a few minutes we talked about ordinary things, work, the weather, mutual friends. Neither of us knew how to begin discussing the real reason we were there. Finally, Daniel took a slow breath. I read Dad's letter again. I looked at him quietly. I've probably read it 20 times. He laughed softly. Every time I get to the part about asking the kindest person to carry all the weight. His voice cracked. I realized he wasn't talking about one dinner. No, I answered gently. Who wasn't? Daniel looked out the cafe window before speaking again. Do you know what scares me the most? I waited. I honestly believed I was a good husband. I didn't interrupt, he continued. Never cheated on you. I never lied about money. I never yelled at you. I thought that meant I was doing enough. I nodded slowly. A lot of people believe that. He smiled sadly. Then Dad's letter made me understand something. He looked directly into my eyes. Being a good husband isn't only about what you don't do. I felt tears building again. It's also about what you choose to do when someone you love needs you. We sat quietly for a long moment. There wasn't much left to say because we both knew the truth now. Understanding it simply hadn't come soon enough. Daniel reached into his jacket pocket and carefully placed his wedding ring on the table. I'm not asking you to make any decision today, he said. I just wanted you to know. I'm ready to accept whatever you decide. I looked at the ring but didn't touch it. I've already decided. He nodded once, almost as though he had expected that answer. You're filing for divorce. It wasn't a question. Yes, his eyes filled with tears, yet he didn't argue. I understand. Those 3 words sounded very different now than they would have a week earlier. This time they carried responsibility instead of avoidance. We stood outside the cafe before leaving. Daniel surprised me by wrapping me in a gentle hug. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't desperate. It was simply a goodbye. I hope someday, he whispered, I become the kind of man Dad believed I could be. I stepped back and smiled through my tears. I hope so too. We walked away in opposite directions without looking back. A month later, the divorce papers were finalized without arguments. We divided everything fairly. I kept my design studio and the small lake house my parents had left me years earlier. Daniel kept our primary residence. Neither of us fought over furniture, savings, or possessions. After everything we'd lost emotionally, those things no longer seemed important. Margaret called me one evening shortly after the divorce became official. I almost didn't answer, but something told me I should. Her voice sounded stronger than it had in weeks. Would you have dinner with me? She asked quietly. Just the 2 of us. I agreed. We met at a small family-owned restaurant across town. For the first time in 10 years, we weren't sitting across from each other as mother-in-law and daughter-in-law. We were simply 2 women carrying regret. Margaret reached into her purse near the end of dinner and placed a small wooden box in front of me. Robert made this himself, she said. Inside was a tiny hand-carved music box. On the bottom he had engraved a single sentence. "Thank you for helping this family become better than we deserved." I couldn't stop crying. Margaret reached across the table and gently squeezed my hand. "Knew," she whispered. "He always knew." I nodded, unable to speak. "And now I finally do too." 6 months passed. My studio grew faster than it ever had before. Without realizing it, I had spent years building other people's dreams while quietly placing my own on hold. Now I accepted projects I genuinely loved. I traveled. I reconnected with friends I had unintentionally neglected. I laughed more easily. One afternoon, while finishing a renovation for a young couple buying their first home, I watched them argue playfully over where to place a bookshelf. The husband smiled, looked at his wife, and said, "Whatever you think is best, we'll figure it out together." Such a simple sentence. Yet it stayed with me for the rest of the day, because I realized trust isn't something you notice when it's there. You only understand its value after you've lived without it. Sometimes people ask whether I regret walking away after 10 years. My answer always surprises them. I don't regret the years I spent loving Daniel. I don't even regret helping his family. Those choices reflected who I was. The only thing I regret is how long I believed earning respect required sacrificing my own. Robert's trust didn't save me. The missing wedding ring didn't change my life. Even the stewardship review wasn't what truly set me free. The moment my life finally changed was much quieter than all of that. It happened the instant I stopped asking myself how to become worthy of being believed, and started asking why the people who loved me had ever needed proof in the first place. 9 months after I walked out of Margaret's dining room, I unlocked the door to my new design studio before sunrise and stood quietly in the middle of the empty showroom. The smell of fresh wood and paint filled the air, and sunlight slowly crept across the hardwood floor through the front windows. The sign outside read Brooks Interior Design, a name I had almost changed after the divorce. In the end, I kept it, not because of Daniel, but because it had become my own long before it had anything to do with my marriage. A name only has the power you give it. I no longer associated it with betrayal. I associated it with survival. My first client wasn't scheduled to arrive for another hour, so I made coffee and walked through the showroom, straightening fabric samples that didn't really need straightening. For years I had believed peace meant making sure everyone around me felt comfortable. Now peace looked much simpler. It looked like opening the doors to a business I built with my own hands. It looked like making decisions without wondering whether someone else would approve. It looked like waking up every morning without feeling responsible for emotions that were never mine to carry. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. When I opened the door, I was surprised to see Margaret standing outside, holding a small bakery box. She looked healthier than she had in months. There were still traces of sadness in her eyes, but something else had replaced the pride that used to live there: humility. "I hope I'm not interrupting," she said. "Not at all." She smiled nervously. "Brought cinnamon rolls. Robert always insisted people shouldn't open a new beginning on an empty stomach." I laughed for what felt like the 100th time in recent months, but unlike the careful laughs I used to force at family gatherings, this one came naturally. "Come in." We sat together near the front window while the coffee brewed. For several minutes we talked about ordinary things. The weather, my newest renovation project, the community charity event Brooks Heritage Furniture had sponsored under its new leadership. Eventually, Margaret looked around the studio before quietly saying, "You know, Robert would have loved this place. I think he would have offered at least 3 suggestions." She laughed. "Probably more." The silence that followed felt comfortable instead of awkward. Finally, she looked at me and said something I never expected to hear. "I've stopped trying to think about you as my former daughter-in-law." I looked up. Why? Because that's the relationship I failed. She gently wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "I'd rather think of you as someone I was fortunate enough to know, even if I realized it much too late." I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "Thank you." That simple moment gave me something I hadn't realized I still needed. Not because her approval suddenly mattered again. It didn't. But because genuine accountability has a quiet power. Margaret wasn't asking me to erase the past. She wasn't asking for another chance. She was simply refusing to hide from what she had done. That mattered. Before leaving, she handed me a folded envelope. Daniel asked me to give you this months ago, she explained. I wasn't sure whether I should. I looked at the handwriting immediately. It was Daniel's. You don't have to read it, she added. I almost threw it away several times. After she left, I carried the envelope into my office and placed it on my desk. I stared at it for nearly half an hour before finally opening it. The letter wasn't long. There were no dramatic declarations or promises to win me back. Daniel had always struggled to express himself with words, but this time every sentence felt painfully honest. Natally, I've spent months trying to figure out which mistake ended our marriage. I finally realized there wasn't one. There were hundreds of small moments when I chose the easier conversation instead of the right one. I kept believing that asking you to be patient proved how much I trusted your strength. I understand now that all I really did was ask you to carry burdens that belonged to me. Dad wasn't disappointed because I failed once. He was disappointed because I kept repeating the same choice until it became part of who I was. I don't expect forgiveness, and I don't expect another beginning. I only hope that one day, if someone asks you whether I ever understood what happened, your answer can honestly be yes. Thank you for loving me longer than I deserved. I hope I become worthy of that lesson, even if it happens without you beside me. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back inside the envelope. For the first time since the divorce, I didn't cry after reading something connected to Daniel. Instead, I felt grateful. Not because he had finally apologized, but because he had finally accepted responsibility without asking me to make him feel better. Healing had reached both of us, even if we were walking separate paths. Later that afternoon, I received an email from the new executive director of Brooks Heritage Furniture. Attached was a photograph of the company's renovated headquarters. Above the main entrance, just beneath the original Brooks family crest, a new bronze plaque had been installed. It contained a single sentence taken directly from Robert's Stewardship Trust. Truth before comfort. People before pride. I smiled for a long time at those words. Robert had built beautiful furniture, but that wasn't his greatest legacy. His greatest legacy was leaving behind a family that, after years of mistakes, finally learned that love without courage eventually becomes empty. As the sun began setting outside my studio, I locked the front door and stood on the sidewalk watching people walk past with shopping bags, children, and dogs pulling gently on their leashes. Life moved forward exactly as it always had. Mine simply felt lighter now. I no longer wondered whether I had been enough. I no longer replayed the accusation about the wedding ring in my mind. I no longer measured my worth by how useful I could be to other people. I finally understood something I wish I had learned years earlier. Respect isn't a reward for endless sacrifice. Trust isn't something you should have to earn every single day from the people who claim to love you. The right people believe your character before they believe an accusation. And if they don't, walking away isn't revenge. Sometimes it's simply the first honest step toward peace. It's been a little over 2 years since the day Margaret's wedding ring disappeared, and people still ask me the same question whenever they hear my story. They always assume the missing ring destroyed my marriage. My answer has never changed. No, the ring didn't ruin my marriage. It simply revealed a truth that had been quietly waiting beneath the surface for years. Daniel and I occasionally exchange polite emails when something practical needs to be discussed. There's no anger left between us anymore, no resentment, no desire to reopen old wounds. What remains is distance, mutual respect, and the understanding that some lessons arrive too late to save a relationship but not too late to change a person. Margaret now spends much of her time volunteering with local charities, and according to people who know her, she often shares the hardest lesson she ever learned. She says apologizing wasn't the difficult part. The difficult part was learning to listen before judging and understanding how much damage can be done when you mistake assumptions for truth. Brooks Heritage Furniture continues to thrive under its new leadership. The company has grown while staying faithful to the principles Robert fought so hard to protect. Every manager who joins the company receives a small handbook explaining the values that guide every important decision. And on the very first page are the words Robert wrote years before any of us realized how important they would become. Truth before comfort. People before pride. As for me, my life isn't perfect, and I no longer expect it to be. There are still mornings when old memories quietly return. There are still moments when I think about the life Daniel and I once dreamed of building together. Some memories still hurt, and perhaps they always will. But I've learned that peace doesn't mean forgetting what happened. Peace means no longer questioning your own worth, because someone else refused to see it. Looking back now, I understand something I wish I had known much earlier. Family isn't defined by sharing the same last name or sitting around the same dinner table. Family is made up of the people who protect your dignity when it's easiest for everyone else to stay silent. And before this story ends, I genuinely love to hear your thoughts. If the person you trusted most had asked you to apologize for something you knew you didn't do, would you have stayed and fought for the relationship, or would you have walked away the moment I did?